A night of no strings, a lifetime of tangles. Jerome Matthews was a man who loved his freedom. At 28, he had managed to carve out a life that avoided deep commitments and stayed clear of complications. His career as a freelance photographer allowed him to move freely from city to city, capturing life's fleeting moments, and his relationships followed the same pattern: short, sweet, and without any promises. It was during one such brief encounter that he met Maria Sullivan, an enigmatic woman with warm brown eyes and an easy smile. They met at a mutual friend's house party on a crisp autumn evening. The chemistry was instant. A few drinks in, their laughter mingled effortlessly, their hands brushing in subtle touches. Jerome wasn't looking for anything serious, and Maria seemed to echo the sentiment, making it clear that she was focused on her own goals. "No drama, no strings," she said with a playful grin. For Jerome, that was exactly what he wanted to hear. Their fling was light and exhilarating, marked by nights of shared wine and stolen kisses under dim streetlights. Jerome felt safe, assuming they both knew where the line was. This wasn't about love. It was about companionship without responsibility, a pleasant distraction from their busy lives. But Maria, as Jerome would soon discover, had plans of her own. A month after their first encounter, Jerome received a text that would shift the foundation of his carefree world. "We need to talk. Can you come over?" It was unlike her to be so direct. Usually, their texts were breezy, filled with casual banter and late-night rendezvous arrangements. Something about the message unsettled him. When Jerome arrived at Maria's apartment, she opened the door with an anxious expression. Her hands fidgeted, twisting a silver ring on her finger. "I took a test," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the city outside. Jerome's heart dropped. He knew what she meant before she even showed him the positive pregnancy test. The sight of it sent a jolt of fear racing through his veins. He stepped back instinctively, as if the small plastic device held the power to trap him in a life he didn't want. "This can't be real," Jerome muttered, pacing the room. "We were careful. This wasn't supposed to happen." Maria leaned against the wall, arms crossed, her gaze steady. "It happened, Jerome, and I'm keeping it." The weight of her words settled heavily in the air. Jerome rubbed his temples, struggling to grasp the situation. "I told you from the beginning I wasn't ready for this. I didn't sign up to be a father." Maria's expression didn't falter. "I know what you said, but this isn't just about you anymore." Over the next few weeks, Jerome tried everything to escape the situation. He offered to pay for whatever Maria needed, hoping that financial support would satisfy her without requiring him to be involved emotionally. But Maria was clear. She didn't just want money. She wanted him to step up and be part of the child's life. Each conversation ended in frustration. "I'm not ready for this," Jerome kept repeating, as if the words alone could undo reality. "I have my whole life ahead of me. I can't let this derail everything." Maria's response was always the same, a quiet, determined look that said she wasn't going to let him run away. Jerome's fear turned into avoidance. He stopped returning her calls and began to distance himself, hoping she'd eventually accept his decision to stay out of the picture. But Maria had no intention of giving up. One morning, Jerome's phone rang, breaking the uneasy silence that had become a constant in his life. The caller ID flashed Mom. His heart sank. He knew without answering that Maria had reached out to his family. She had crossed the line he thought they had agreed never to cross. "Why didn't you tell us, Jerome?" His mother's voice was filled with both confusion and disappointment. "We had to hear it from a stranger." Jerome's father, a stern but fair man, chimed in, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken judgment. "This isn't how we raised you, son. You have a responsibility now." The conversation ended with his parents urging him to come home, to explain himself and figure out a way to handle the situation like an adult. The walls Jerome had so carefully constructed to separate his personal life from his family's influence were beginning to crumble. That weekend, Jerome found himself sitting in his parents' living room, facing the disappointment in their eyes. His mother, always the optimist, tried to see the silver lining. This child could be a blessing. "Jerome," she said softly, placing a hand on his knee. "You just have to give it a chance." His father's gaze was harder to meet, his silence speaking louder than words. "You can't run from this," he finally said. "It's time to step up." Jerome left their house that night feeling more trapped than ever. His family's expectations, Maria's determination, and the weight of the unborn child pressed down on him like a crushing burden. In the weeks that followed, Jerome tried to reclaim some semblance of control over his life. He threw himself into work, accepting every photography assignment he could find. But no matter how busy he kept himself, the thought of the baby gnawed at the back of his mind. Then came the baby shower, an event Maria had planned meticulously, inviting not just her own family but Jerome's as well. When Jerome arrived at her apartment that day, he felt as though he were stepping into a trap. The room was filled with balloons, gifts, and relatives exchanging excited whispers about the baby's future. Jerome stood awkwardly in the corner, trying to remain invisible, but Maria wouldn't let him disappear. "Come feel the baby kick," she called out, drawing him toward her. He placed a hesitant hand on her belly, feeling the faint flutter of movement. Something shifted in Jerome at that moment. For the first time, the reality of the life growing inside Maria hit him fully. This wasn't just an inconvenience. This was his child. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. "A child could be a blessing, Jerome. You just have to give it a chance." But as the baby shower wound down and the guests began to leave, Maria pulled him aside. "I know this isn't how you planned your life," she whispered, her eyes filled with hope. "But maybe it's not such a bad thing. Maybe this baby can bring us closer." Jerome forced a smile, knowing that Maria's hopes for a deeper relationship would only complicate things further. He had to find a way to be involved in his child's life without losing himself in the process. Little did Jerome know, the true test of his resolve was yet to come, a test that would force him to confront not just his fears, but the very foundations of who he thought he was. This is the beginning of Jerome's journey, a path filled with unexpected twists, emotional battles, and a gradual realization that life's greatest challenges often come with the potential for unexpected growth. In Part 2, Jerome will face even tougher decisions as Maria's manipulations escalate, and he must decide what kind of father and man he wants to be. The boundaries begin to blur. Jerome tried to convince himself that attending the baby shower was the right thing to do, but deep down, he knew it had shifted something fundamental in his life. The flutter he felt when the baby kicked wasn't just a physical sensation. It stirred emotions he wasn't ready to face. But despite this momentary connection, Jerome was determined to keep things under control. Being there for his child didn't mean losing himself in Maria's expectations of what a family should look like. He promised himself that he would set firm boundaries with Maria. They would co-parent, nothing more. But as the weeks passed, Jerome realized that keeping those lines intact would be far more difficult than he had imagined. Maria wasn't content with co-parenting. She wanted more time, more connection, and more involvement in his life than Jerome was willing to offer. Maria's attempts to close the emotional distance between them started subtly. At first, she texted him late at night, claiming she needed his advice on baby-related decisions. "Which crib looks better?" she asked one night, sending photos of two nearly identical cribs. Jerome groaned, rubbing his eyes. "Maria, just pick one," he replied, trying to maintain distance. But the questions kept coming. What stroller to buy? What baby clothes were cutest? What doctor they should visit? Jerome knew these weren't just practical questions. They were attempts to pull them closer. He tried to keep his responses short, but each interaction felt like Maria was tightening an invisible thread around him. Then came the favors. "Can you stop by after work and help me set up the nursery? I need a ride to my doctor's appointment. It's just a quick checkup." Every time Jerome tried to say no, she would remind him gently, "It's not just for me. It's for our baby." The baby had become Maria's trump card, and she played it with precision. Jerome's frustration grew with every boundary she crossed, but each time he found himself giving in. He wasn't doing it for her. He was doing it for the daughter he had yet to meet, or at least that's what he told himself. One rainy evening, after another long day of work, Jerome found himself assembling a crib in Maria's apartment. He had agreed to help under the condition that it would be the last time she asked for something non-essential. But as he tightened the last screw, Maria handed him a cup of tea and sat down on the floor beside him. "You're a natural at this," she said, her voice soft. "I think you'll be a great dad." Jerome shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. "I'm just trying to do what's right for the baby." Maria leaned in slightly, her tone hopeful. "You know, Jerome, we could try to make this work. We don't have to be strangers raising a kid together. We could be a family." Jerome froze, the wrench in his hand slipping from his grasp. He knew this conversation was coming, but it still caught him off guard. "Maria, we talked about this. I'll be here for the baby, but I can't be what you want me to be." Her face tightened for a moment, disappointment flickering in her eyes before she masked it with a forced smile. "I know," she whispered, looking down at her hands. "I just thought, maybe things could change." Jerome stood up, brushing off his hands. "They haven't, Maria. I'm not going to lead you on. This is about the baby. That's it." Maria nodded, but Jerome could see the frustration simmering beneath her calm exterior. He knew that she wouldn't let go of the idea so easily. In the following weeks, Jerome tried to maintain his distance, but Maria found new ways to pull him back. Every time he tried to create space, she would text him with updates about the baby. Doctor's appointments, ultrasound pictures, even little kicks she felt throughout the day. He wanted to ignore the messages, but he couldn't. The thought of missing out on important moments in his daughter's life gnawed at him. One day, Maria sent him a message that changed everything. "We found out the gender. It's a girl." Jerome stared at the text for a long time, his heart pounding in his chest. A daughter. He hadn't thought much about what it would be like to have a child, let alone a little girl. For the first time, the future felt real, terrifyingly real. He responded simply, "That's amazing." But Maria wasn't satisfied with a simple message. She wanted more from him, more involvement, more connection, and she wasn't going to wait for Jerome to come around. One weekend, she invited him to another ultrasound appointment, saying it would be nice for him to see their daughter in real time. "It's the 3D one," she added, as if the technology would somehow sway him. Jerome hesitated but ultimately agreed. He told himself he was doing it for his daughter, not for Maria. When they arrived at the clinic, Jerome felt a strange sense of awe watching the grainy image of his daughter move on the screen. Her tiny hands twitched, and he saw the faint outline of her nose. It was surreal, both beautiful and overwhelming. Maria glanced at him with a soft smile. "She looks just like you," she whispered. Jerome didn't respond. He couldn't. The emotions swirling inside him were too complicated to put into words. As the due date approached, Maria's demands intensified. She wanted Jerome at every appointment, every class, every planning session. And when he wasn't physically there, she flooded him with texts and calls. Jerome began to feel suffocated, but each time he tried to pull away, she reminded him, "It's for our baby." The final straw came one night when Maria called him in tears. "I can't do this alone, Jerome," she sobbed. "I need you here, please." Jerome's heart ached with guilt, but he knew he couldn't let her emotional manipulation dictate his life. He made a decision then, a painful but necessary one. He would stay involved in his daughter's life, but he had to set boundaries with Maria, no matter how difficult it would be. The next morning, Jerome sat down with Maria and told her the truth. "I'll be there for our daughter. I'll support her in every way I can, but I can't give you what you're looking for, Maria. We're not a couple, and we never will be." Maria's expression hardened, the hope in her eyes extinguished. "So that's it," she whispered. We're just co-parents. Jerome nodded. Yes, that's all we can be. Maria stared at him for a long moment, then looked away. Fine, she muttered, her voice cold. But don't think this is over, Jerome. Not by a long shot. Jerome felt a chill run down his spine at the subtle threat in her words. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Maria wasn't going to let him walk away without a fight. But for the first time since this ordeal began, Jerome felt a sense of clarity. He knew what he had to do, for his daughter, and for himself. The lines had been drawn, and he was determined to stick to them. In Part 3, the conflict between Jerome and Maria escalates as the baby arrives. Jerome will have to navigate the challenges of fatherhood while dealing with Maria's increasing manipulation, forcing him to make difficult choices that will test his resolve and character. A father's first test. The day his daughter was born was both the most exhilarating and terrifying experience of Jerome's life. He wasn't sure how he had ended up standing in the hospital room, gripping Maria's hand, but the moment the doctor announced, "It's a girl," everything changed. Jerome stared in disbelief at the tiny human swaddled in a pink blanket, her delicate face scrunched in confusion as she adjusted to the world. She was so small, so fragile, and yet the weight of her presence was overwhelming. Maria looked at him with exhausted triumph. "Meet your daughter, Jerome." He held the baby awkwardly at first, afraid he might break her, but as she settled into his arms, something inside him shifted. The fear, resentment, and frustration that had haunted him melted away, replaced by a fierce determination. This was his daughter, his responsibility. And no matter what happened with Maria, he knew he would be there for her. But as he looked down at his newborn daughter, cradling her gently, Jerome realized something troubling. The boundaries he thought he had set with Maria were already beginning to blur. The calm before the storm. For the first few days after the birth, everything seemed peaceful. Jerome visited the hospital daily, spending hours with his daughter, whom Maria had named Zoe. She smiled whenever he held her, and Jerome marveled at every tiny breath she took. Maria, exhausted but glowing with maternal pride, was unusually cooperative. She didn't push him for more time together or demand emotional closeness. For a brief moment, Jerome thought maybe they could make this co-parenting arrangement work. But that peace didn't last long. The day Maria and Zoe were discharged from the hospital, Jerome offered to drive them home. As they pulled up to her apartment building, Maria turned to him, her expression neutral but her words loaded. "Do you want to come inside and stay with us tonight?" Jerome tensed. "Maria, we talked about this. I'll be here for Zoe, but we're not." "I get it," Maria interrupted, forcing a tight smile. "I just thought. Never mind. Thanks for the ride." Jerome hesitated, guilt tugging at him as Maria struggled to balance Zoe and her diaper bag. But he reminded himself that this was part of the boundary they had agreed on. "You're her father, not her partner," he told himself. Still, as he drove away, a knot tightened in his chest. He could feel it. Maria wasn't giving up. The first signs of trouble. Over the next few weeks, Jerome visited often, making sure he was involved in Zoe's life. But Maria began to test the limits of their arrangement, inching closer and closer to crossing the boundaries he had set. She would ask him to stay just a little longer after visits, and when he said no, her disappointment was palpable. She sent texts late into the night, not just about Zoe, but about her own struggles, how lonely she felt, how hard it was to do everything on her own. Jerome tried to keep his responses polite but distant. He told himself he wasn't responsible for Maria's emotions, only Zoe's well-being. But the guilt gnawed at him, especially when she would say things like, "You're always here for her. When will you be here for me?" One night, Maria called him at midnight, her voice shaking with barely contained frustration. "Zoe won't stop crying, and I'm exhausted. I just need you here for one night, Jerome. Please." Jerome sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Maria, I can't keep coming over every time something goes wrong. We need to figure out a routine." You don't get it, Maria snapped, her voice cracking. I'm doing this all by myself, and you get to walk away whenever you want. That's not fair. The words stung, but Jerome knew he had to stand his ground. I'm here for Zoe, Maria. But we agreed. We're not a couple. I'll help with her, but I won't stay over. Maria's silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Jerome knew this wouldn't be the last time they had this conversation. A breaking point. The conflict between them came to a head one stormy night. 3 months after Zoe's birth, Maria called Jerome, her voice frantic. The power's out, and Zoe won't stop crying. I don't know what to do. Jerome groaned, already pulling on his shoes. Okay, I'll come over. Just hang tight. When he arrived, the apartment was dark, lit only by the glow of candles scattered across the room. Zoe's wails filled the small space, and Maria looked on the verge of tears herself. Jerome scooped Zoe into his arms and rocked her gently until she quieted down. Maria watched him, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and longing. You're so good with her, she whispered. Why can't you just stay? Why can't we try to be a family? Jerome shook his head, his voice firm, but calm. Because that's not what we are, Maria. I'm here for Zoe. And that's it. Maria's face twisted with frustration. You can't keep doing this, Jerome. You can't just show up when it's convenient for you and leave me to deal with everything else. Jerome's patience snapped. I never asked for this, Maria. You knew from the start I didn't want a relationship, but you decided to have Zoe anyway. I'm doing the best I can, but I can't be everything for you. Maria's eyes filled with tears, but there was an edge of anger in her voice. You think you can just walk away from me? From us? You'll see, Jerome. You'll see how hard it is. Jerome felt a chill run down his spine. The conversation had taken a dangerous turn, and he knew things were only going to get more complicated. An ultimatum. A week later, Maria called again, but this time her tone was different. Calm, almost smug. I've been thinking, Jerome, she said. You need to start paying more than just child support. Zoe needs stability, and if you won't be here for us, I'll make sure the courts get involved. Jerome's heart sank. He knew Maria was serious, and he also knew that fighting her would be a messy, painful process. Maria, we don't need to do this through the courts. I'll take care of Zoe. You know that. I know, Maria replied sweetly, but I want more than just care, Jerome. I want commitment. If you won't give it willingly, well, we'll see what a judge has to say. Jerome closed his eyes, feeling trapped. The life he had so carefully tried to control was slipping through his fingers, and he didn't know how to stop it. Legal shadows and emotional battles. The court summons arrived on a rainy morning, slipping through Jerome's mail slot like an unwanted ghost. The envelope was crisp and foreboding, and as he opened it with trembling hands, he felt the walls of his life closing in. Maria had filed for full custody. Jerome's stomach churned as he scanned the document. It was all there in black and white. Child support demands, visitation schedules limited to weekends, and a claim that Jerome's involvement had been inconsistent. The reality hit him hard. Maria was no longer just tugging at emotional strings. She was going after him legally, forcing his hand in a way that felt both unfair and inevitable. If he didn't fight back, he would become a visitor in Zoe's life, little more than a weekend dad. The thought terrified him. The first blow, meeting the lawyer. That same afternoon, Jerome sat stiffly in a lawyer's office, the sterile smell of paper and ink adding to his anxiety. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Ms. Alston, flipped through the custody papers. Let me be honest with you, Jerome, she said, not looking up. You're in a tough spot. Courts usually favor stability for the child. If the mother can convince the judge that you're only a sporadic presence, things could get messy fast. Jerome clenched his fists. That's not fair. I've been there for Zoe since day one. Maria just. She wants more than I can give her. Ms. Alston raised an eyebrow. More than you can give Zoe? or more than you can give Maria. Jerome exhaled slowly. Both, I guess. I never wanted a relationship with her. I just want to be a good father to Zoe. The lawyer gave him a sympathetic smile. I understand. But in family court, appearances matter. If Maria makes it look like you've been absent or unreliable, the judge won't care about your intentions. What you need is a plan, something that shows you're committed to Zoe's well-being, no matter what. Jerome rubbed his face, exhaustion washing over him. What kind of plan? Shared custody, Ms. Alston said without hesitation. If you can show the court that you're capable of co-parenting and have a stable environment for Zoe, you'll have a fighting chance. Jerome nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. This was going to be a battle. The emotional fallout. Over the following days, Jerome's world spiraled into chaos. He juggled work, lawyer meetings, and endless messages from Maria, each one tinged with passive-aggressive threats. You're putting Zoe through this because you're selfish, one text read. Another said, I thought you'd change, Jerome. Guess I was wrong. Jerome tried to focus on the bigger picture, Zoe. But Maria's words cut deep, stirring emotions he hadn't expected. Guilt gnawed at him. Could he have tried harder to make things work with Maria? Could he have avoided this mess? The worst part was facing his family. His mother called frequently, offering unsolicited advice. Jerome, just try to make peace with her, she urged. This is about Zoe now. It's not about you. His father, however, was less forgiving. You should have been smarter, son. Now you have to deal with the consequences. The constant reminders of his failures weighed him down. But through it all, one thing remained clear. He couldn't abandon Zoe, no matter how difficult things became. A father's commitment. One evening, after a long day of work and court preparation, Jerome found himself sitting in the dim light of his apartment, scrolling through pictures of Zoe on his phone. Her chubby cheeks and wide, curious eyes stared back at him, filling him with both joy and sorrow. This is what it's all for, he reminded himself. In a moment of clarity, Jerome made a decision that had been brewing in the back of his mind for weeks. If he wanted to fight for Zoe, he needed more than just words. He needed to build a life that included her. The next morning, Jerome met with a real estate agent. His plan was simple but daunting. He would move into a 2-bedroom apartment, with space for Zoe to have her own room. It wasn't just about impressing the court. It was about proving to himself that he could step up. Within a month, Jerome found the perfect place. It was small but cozy, with bright windows and a tiny backyard where Zoe could one day play. As he painted her room pale lavender, a sense of purpose washed over him. This wasn't just a gesture. This was home, a place where his daughter would always be welcome. Courtroom confrontations. The day of the custody hearing arrived faster than Jerome had anticipated. The courtroom felt cold and intimidating, with its high ceilings and rows of uncomfortable benches. Maria sat across from him, her expression smug but tense, while Jerome clenched his jaw and waited for the judge to enter. Ms. Alston had warned him to stay calm, no matter what happened. You need to show the judge that you're focused on Zoe's best interests, not on any resentment you have toward Maria. When the judge finally took her seat, the proceedings began. Maria's lawyer painted a grim picture of Jerome, a man who, according to Maria, had been distant and unreliable, more interested in his freedom than in fatherhood. Jerome's heart sank as he listened to the lies. But when it was his turn to speak, he looked the judge in the eye and told his story, how he had been there for Zoe from the beginning, how he had secured a new home with a room just for her, and how deeply he loved his daughter. I never asked for this situation, Jerome admitted, but Zoe is here now, and I want to be a part of her life. No matter what happens between Maria and me, my daughter deserves to know her father. The courtroom fell silent as Jerome finished. Maria shifted uncomfortably in her seat, the confident facade cracking ever so slightly. A shocking twist. Just when Jerome thought the worst was behind him, Maria dropped a bombshell that took everyone by surprise. "I wasn't going to mention this," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of regret and defiance. "But Jerome has another child." The room froze. Jerome's breath caught in his throat. What is she talking about? The judge looked between them, frowning. "Mr. Williams, is this true?" Jerome shook his head, stunned. "No, I have no idea what she's talking about." Maria's lawyer slid a folder across the table. "We have evidence that Jerome fathered another child through a previous relationship. The mother reached out to Maria recently, asking for help." Jerome's mind reeled. This wasn't just a custody battle anymore. It was an ambush. And if the judge believed Maria's story, it could destroy his case. The web of deceit and unraveling truths. Jerome sat frozen in the courtroom, stunned by Maria's shocking revelation. The words echoed in his mind. Another child. He could feel the judge's eyes on him, waiting for an explanation he didn't have. Maria sat with a mixture of smugness and false regret, as if she had just delivered the finishing blow to his credibility. The judge cleared her throat. "Mr. Williams, do you wish to respond to these allegations?" Jerome clenched his fists, heart hammering. "This can't be real. There's no way I have another child." "I don't know what she's talking about," Jerome said firmly, locking eyes with the judge. "This is a lie." Maria's lawyer handed over a series of documents, photographs, messages between Maria and the supposed mother, and what looked like a paternity claim filed against Jerome. His world, already fragile, seemed to fracture further under the weight of this new accusation, challenging the lie. Back in Ms. Alston's office later that day, Jerome paced furiously. How could she do this? "This is insane. I've never even met this other woman," he exclaimed. Ms. Alston skimmed the documents. "If this is a lie, we'll expose it. But Maria's plain dirty. She's betting that this will cast doubt on your character. We need to act fast." Jerome shook his head in disbelief. "She's dragging some stranger into this just to ruin me." Ms. Alston gave him a tight-lipped smile. "It wouldn't be the first time people pull stunts in custody battles. But if this is fabricated, we'll find out. I'll petition the court for a DNA test." Jerome nodded, a cold determination settling in his chest. He wasn't just fighting for custody anymore. He was fighting for the truth. A desperate search for answers. The following days were a whirlwind. Jerome hired a private investigator to dig into the supposed mother's background. If she was in on Maria's scheme, Jerome needed proof. At the same time, Ms. Alston filed an emergency motion with the court for a DNA test, which was quickly approved. The test would determine once and for all if the child Maria claimed was his had any genetic connection to him. Despite his efforts to stay focused, the emotional strain was relentless. At night, Jerome lay awake, haunted by the possibility that Maria might succeed in turning his life into a nightmare. Even his visits with Zoe became bittersweet. As he cradled her in his arms, he couldn't shake the fear that Maria's lies might rob him of these precious moments. The truth emerges. A week later, the private investigator called Jerome with a startling revelation. "You were right," the investigator said. "This other woman, Tina, has no connection to you. She's a friend of Maria's. They cooked this up together, likely to manipulate the custody outcome." Jerome's blood boiled. Maria set this whole thing up. He thanked the investigator and called Ms. Alston immediately. "This is our smoking gun," Ms. Alston said confidently. "We'll present this evidence along with the DNA test results in court. This should demolish Maria's credibility." 2 days later, the DNA results came in, confirming what Jerome had known all along. He was not the father of Tina's child. The courtroom showdown. When they returned to court, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Maria sat across the room, her smug expression faltering as Jerome and Ms. Alston entered with confidence. The judge wasted no time. Ms. Alston presented the DNA test results and the investigator's findings, laying bare Maria's deceit. "Your Honor," Ms. Alston said firmly, It is clear that my client has been the victim of an elaborate scheme designed to tarnish his reputation and disrupt his relationship with his daughter. Maria shifted uncomfortably in her seat, the weight of the evidence crushing the last remnants of her defense. The judge's face was stern. Ms. Rivera, this court takes allegations of this nature very seriously. The manipulation of legal proceedings will not be tolerated. She paused, flipping through her notes. Given the facts presented, I see no reason to deny Mr. Williams shared custody of Zoe. It is clear he has demonstrated a sincere commitment to his daughter's well-being. Jerome exhaled in relief as the judge's decision was finalized. The battle was over, but the victory felt bittersweet. Confrontation and closure. After the hearing, Maria cornered Jerome in the hallway outside the courtroom. I didn't mean for it to get this far, she whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. I didn't want to lose you. Jerome's jaw tightened. This was never about us, Maria. It's about Zoe. And what you did. You almost ruined everything. Maria sniffled, her shoulders slumping. I just wanted us to be a family. Jerome's anger softened slightly, but his resolve remained firm. Zoe will have a family, with both of us, but as co-parents, nothing more. Maria nodded slowly, her expression a mixture of regret and acceptance. Jerome knew this wasn't the ending she had hoped for, but it was the only way forward. A new beginning. In the weeks that followed, Jerome threw himself into fatherhood with renewed purpose. Every moment with Zoe felt like a gift, a reminder of what he had fought so hard to protect. His apartment became a second home for Zoe. Her laughter filled the small space, and every visit deepened their bond. Jerome no longer saw fatherhood as a burden. It was a privilege, one he embraced fully. He and Maria maintained a cordial relationship, focusing on Zoe's needs and keeping their interactions professional. It wasn't always easy, but Jerome was determined to provide stability for his daughter. One evening, as Zoe slept peacefully in her crib, Jerome sat by her side and reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The challenges, the betrayals, and the battles had reshaped him into a man he barely recognized. A man stronger, wiser, and deeply committed to the people he loved. This wasn't the life he had imagined. But as he gazed at his daughter's sleeping face, Jerome realized it was exactly the life he was meant to live. The road to redemption and unexpected turns. Jerome sat quietly at his kitchen table, sipping coffee while Zoe napped in her crib nearby. Life had begun to stabilize, but the quiet moments often brought reflection. His journey to fatherhood had been anything but smooth, filled with betrayal, manipulation, and emotional turmoil. Yet, through it all, Jerome had found clarity. Fatherhood wasn't a trap, but a responsibility he embraced. But life, Jerome had learned, rarely moved in a straight line. Just when things seemed settled, an unexpected twist appeared on the horizon. Maria's ultimatum. 3 months after the court hearing, Maria requested a meeting with Jerome. She had been distant but cooperative since their last encounter, and Jerome hoped that things were finally smoothing out. He agreed to meet her at a local cafe, leaving Zoe with a sitter. Maria arrived, looking tense, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her purse. I've been thinking a lot, she said, avoiding eye contact. And I need to talk to you about something serious. Jerome raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, waiting for her to continue. Maria took a deep breath. I've decided I want to move back to Atlanta. My mom's there, and I think it's the best place for Zoe to grow up. The words hit Jerome like a punch. What? He asked, his voice sharp. You want to take Zoe out of state? Are you serious? Maria nodded, her expression both determined and apologetic. I need family support, Jerome. I can't do this on my own anymore. It'll be better for Zoe too. She'll have a big family around her. Cousins, grandparents, the whole thing. Jerome clenched his jaw, trying to keep his anger in check. Maria, you can't just take her away like that. I've been here every step of the way. I fought for custody. I fought for her, You can't uproot my daughter's life like this." Maria's eyes softened slightly, but her resolve remained firm. "I'll make sure you can visit any time. We can work something out." But Jerome knew what that really meant. Visitation weekends, long flights, missed milestones, and slowly becoming a distant figure in Zoe's life. It wasn't something he could accept. Seeking legal advice. Again, Jerome stormed into Ms. Alston's office the next morning, furious and panicking. "She's trying to move out of state with Zoe," he said, pacing back and forth. "I can't let that happen." Ms. Alston folded her hands on the desk, calm as always. "Maria will need court approval to relocate. If you contest it, she'll have to prove that the move is in Zoe's best interest. That's not an easy case to make, considering how involved you've been." Jerome sat down, rubbing his hands over his face. "So you think I have a chance?" Ms. Alston gave a small smile. "Not just a chance. We have a strong case. Courts generally prefer stability, and moving a child far away from a dedicated parent, that's a hard sell." Jerome exhaled, feeling some of the weight lift off his chest. But he knew the battle wasn't over yet. The mediation meeting. Before the court hearing, they were required to attend a mediation session. Jerome walked in determined, prepared to argue his case. Maria sat across the table from him, looking tired but defiant. "I'm not trying to take Zoe away from you, Jerome," Maria began. "I just need to do what's right for me and her." "And what about what's right for me?" Jerome shot back. "I've been here, Maria. Every step of the way. You can't just leave and expect me to watch from a distance." The mediator intervened, trying to calm the tension. "Let's focus on Zoe's well-being. Jerome, if Maria stays, would you be willing to work out a more cooperative schedule?" Jerome clenched his fists, but then relaxed. "I'm willing to make things work, but not if it means losing my daughter to another state." Maria's expression wavered, but she stayed firm. I need a fresh start." Jerome leaned forward, locking eyes with her. "We all need fresh starts sometimes, but Zoe needs both her parents, not just you." The final court hearing. Despite mediation, Maria pressed forward with the relocation request, and they found themselves back in court. Jerome sat on edge as the judge listened to arguments from both sides. Maria's lawyer painted a picture of opportunity and family support in Atlanta, but Ms. Alston focused on Jerome's consistent involvement and the importance of stability in Zoe's life. When the judge finally spoke, her tone was measured. "While I understand Ms. Rivera's desire for family support, the primary consideration in this case is the child's well-being. It is clear that Mr. Williams has been actively involved in his daughter's life, and relocating would create unnecessary disruption." Jerome held his breath as the judge continued. "The court denies Ms. Rivera's request for relocation. Both parents will maintain joint custody within the current jurisdiction." Relief washed over Jerome like a tidal wave. He glanced at Maria, whose expression was unreadable, somewhere between frustration and acceptance. A new understanding. After the hearing, Maria approached Jerome in the hallway, her shoulders slumped in defeat. "I didn't want it to come to this," she whispered. I thought moving would fix everything." Jerome sighed. "I know you want what's best for Zoe, but we both have to be here for her. Running away won't solve anything." Maria nodded slowly, tears brimming in her eyes. "I'll try to do better. I promise." For the first time in a long while, Jerome saw a glimmer of the person Maria used to be, the woman who once seemed full of hope and excitement. Maybe they would never be a family in the traditional sense, but they could be partners in raising their daughter. The journey ahead. Over the next few months, Jerome and Maria slowly built a new dynamic, one based on respect and cooperation. They agreed to more flexible schedules, holidays spent together for Zoe's sake, and open communication. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. One evening, as Jerome tucked Zoe into bed at his apartment, he felt a deep sense of peace. The road ahead would have challenges, no doubt, but he was ready for them. Zoe stirred in her sleep, her tiny hand clutching his finger. Jerome smiled, rushing a kiss over her forehead. This was his life now. Not the life he had imagined, but the one he had fought for, and won. And for the first time, he felt grateful. Not just for Zoe, but for the lessons along the way. The struggles that had reshaped him into the man and father he was today. Because life wasn't about things going according to plan. It was about showing up, every single day, and doing your best with what you had. And Jerome, he was ready for whatever came next.